Comments?
Well, I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you for that eloquent and kind of revivifying presentation of ethics and the law. I feel like I've been woken up from a deep, deep, deep sleep.
Well, maybe you've been put to sleep.
Not in the least, woken up. The fact is that the world that you described is kind of a little sunlight place, particularly after living for a time in the world of these memoranda. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it isn't simply the first two memoranda written under pressure in the spring of 2002, as indeed Abu Zubaydah was being interrogated in a distant place. And there's great drama here. And again, the OPR report is worth reading just because it describes the conditions under which these memos were written, the pressures involved, and step by step, in a very interesting way. It was the later memoranda that were written under very different conditions that essentially shook off some of the more embarrassing parts of the earlier ones, but stayed with precisely the same conclusions. And I guess the thing I want to ask you is, the world we're seeing in those memos, in the early ones but in the later ones as well, is a world in which the client is CIA people who are about to do what they're going to do. That is not in question. And the administration that wants those things to be done, and the assignment is to write things that will make it legal, convincing enough for the CIA to go ahead. That is, it simply has no relation, so far as I can see, at least there's no evidence of it, of any of the considerations that you were discussing. And I think Zelikow, who did a wonderful speech on this called, I think, Legal Policy for the Twilight War, pointed out, we asked the lawyer, we called in the lawyers, asked them what can we do. There was never a discussion of what should we do.
Yes.
And your presentation, it seems to me, was about the should being asked by the lawyers, but they never did.
No. Well, I think the reason that they had a White House counsel, they had their own lawyers
who was urging them on to get this memo done,
and then they had OLC. They wanted OLC to write the memos, not partly because they are probably smarter than the guys in the White House counsel, but also because then they would have the patina of having come from OLC. They would not be just the president's lawyers telling him. They'd be OLC, which has this reputation of giving opinions that are treated as law because they are approached as law. You see, so they picked OLC precisely because they wanted that patina, and then they got OLC to give them opinions that didn't have that patina, that didn't have that quality, to give them opinions as if they were just hired guns.
But they do in effect have that quality when it comes. Maybe Jamil will have a different opinion when it comes to the consequence.
Well, yes. As to I just meant that in fact they weren't OLC quality memos that they got. They got hired gun memos, but they got the benefit of pretending that they were OLC quality. They got the credibility of the office. I'll give you a little war story that perhaps I shouldn't do, but when I was a lawyer, I served as a lawyer for the Secretary of the Air Force, and at one point, this was when President Eisenhower was president, I was asked to come and do some work for the White House, precisely because I was the most liberal lawyer they knew. And they wanted to have a draft made of a new national security regulation for testing the security of government employees and contractors and so on. And they decided to start by getting a liberal to draft the first draft. Now that's just complete. Now, this wasn't an emergency in the sense that the communists were about to take over and blow us up and so on, but it was in the midst of anti-communist hysteria. And so, you can have clients, you can have presidents who, in this little, level, nobody sees this, who want to do the right thing and want to see the right thing done.
comments, Jamil?
I'm just wondering if you've seen the memo that Alberto Mora wrote. He was the General Counsel of the Navy, and he wrote a memo.
He spoke here on campus.
He spoke here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the people who dissented from
Yes,
the torture
yes,
program, and he
yes.
wrote this quite amazing memo in 2002. Yeah, I think late 2002,
Late
right?
2000, which had dramatic results, actually.
Right, briefly.
Briefly.
Right. I mean, it basically got Secretary Rumsfeld to withdraw the 2002 interrogation directive. He then reissued it 4 months later in a different guise, but
With the help of John Yoo, actually.
with the help of John Yoo. But the memo that Alberto Mora wrote seems to me to have the qualities that you were describing.
Well, I confess I haven't read it. I will look at it. I'm sure it sounds like it does, and it does show you. I mean, it's not easy to stand up to these guys, and that has to be admitted. And it's not easy to say, well, you know, I'm just going to insist on the law. Never mind if they blow up the two more World Trade Centers. You know, you have to. You can't just shrug it off. But if you have enough perspective, I think that what Mora did, you know, he did this in 2002. You know, so everything was very high pressure then. It can be done.
Okay. Jean Maria, did you have a comment?
I think an approach to your dilemma that's practically used about personhood is, as philosophers say, in philosophers' terms, would be to say those people are not in our moral community.
Yes.
Or in psychological terms would be to dehumanize them. Right?
Yes, right.
And isn't that what the torture memos sort of say? You know, if you or I were waterboarded, it would be torture, but if they're waterboarded, it's not really.
Well, absolutely, and I think that's entirely right. And ethically, if I can do it, and I have principles that allow me to do it, then under those same conditions, they can do it. And what you can't do is just prefer yourself. You can't just say, I'll make a cost-benefit analysis of what's best for us, without taking into account whomever else is in this relevant community. And so, you know, one of the issues when you're making, and this is the point about utilitarianism, when you're trying to decide what's the greatest good for the greatest number, you got to find out who the people are that you're polling, right? Who's in the moral community that we're talking about? And for some purposes, the people that we're calling the enemy are in our moral community. The guy that you have on the rack and screw there, he's in your moral community for purposes of your treatment of him as a person.
You know, it should be said that the memos themselves don't draw that distinction, and that one of the arguments raised by Phil Zelikow when he was at the State Department, when he's trying to get these put aside, was the fact that if you follow the reasoning backward, and this is a complicated thing that we can't get into, but if you follow the reasoning backward, they essentially, a couple of the memos essentially mean that you can torture within the United States. That's the implication of the reasoning. And he did try, he has actually a memo setting this out that's very interesting, but in fact, they didn't draw that distinction at all, on the contrary.